The golden sun of Miami painted the horizon as the Rodriguez family arrived at the edge of the Everglades for their long-awaited weekend escape. Don Alejandro, a passionate nature lover in his early 50s, had dreamt of exploring this part of Florida ever since his childhood in Havana. His children, Carlos, age 16, adventurous and cheeky; Sofia, age 14, witty and sharp; and little Mateo, age 9, full of curiosity, had been planning a surprise. As they unpacked their belongings from the car, Don Alejandro noticed only 3 sleeping bags being taken into the modest wooden cabin they had rented. He raised an eyebrow. "Where's mine?" he asked with a chuckle. Carlos grinned and motioned toward the back of the car. "We have something special for you, Poppy." There it was. A single-person camping tent, brand new, standing a few yards away from the cabin's porch, just beside the tree line that marked the start of the swamp. "You said you loved nature," Sofia teased. "Now you get to sleep under the stars." Full immersion. Don Alejandro laughed heartily, placing a hand on his chest.
Dios mío.
What a gift. You kids really know how to spoil your old man. That night, as the family sat around a small fire roasting marshmallows and telling jokes, Don Alejandro's tent glowed gently in the background, its fabric shimmering under the moonlight. He sipped his coffee slowly, smiling at the buzzing of crickets and the distant call of a heron. When it was finally time for bed, the children retreated into the cabin, still giggling over their prank. Don Alejandro zipped himself into the tent with a satisfied sigh. The swamp sounds wrapped around him like an old lullaby. Frogs croaked, owls hooted, and the wind rustled the sawgrass. But sometime past midnight, he woke up. It was not the heat or the humidity that stirred him. It was the absence of sound. The buzzing of insects had stopped. No rustling. No night birds. Only silence. Then came the softest thud. Something or someone had brushed against the side of the tent. Don Alejandro stayed still, listening. Another thud. This time closer. He reached for the small flashlight he always kept beside his sleeping bag and turned it on. A weak beam illuminated the thin fabric of the tent. Shadows danced. Suddenly, a low humming noise began to rise from the swamp beyond the trees. Not mechanical. Not natural. Something in between. He crawled silently to the flap, unzipped it ever so slightly, and peered outside. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Floating lights. Small orbs, bluish and pulsing, drifting just above the waterline beyond the trees. They moved with purpose, as if searching, and they were getting closer. Don Alejandro held his breath, watching as the orbs glided silently through the swamp. They didn't flicker like fireflies, nor did they hum like drones. Their light was steady, and their movement too precise to be natural. He ducked back into the tent, his mind racing. Were these some kind of new technology? A prank? Something scientific he didn't yet understand? But something deep in his gut said otherwise. Grabbing his phone, he activated the camera. He peeked out once more, this time recording. The orbs moved past the tree line and into the clearing, hovering just above the ground where the tall grass had been trampled. They pulsed in unison, like a heartbeat. Then, without warning, they shot straight up into the air and disappeared into the canopy. Silence returned. Slowly, the normal sounds of the swamp resumed. The frogs, the breeze, the hum of insects. Don Alejandro waited a moment longer before unzipping the tent fully. He stepped out, barefoot on the cool, damp ground. Every instinct in him said not to move, not to investigate. But curiosity had always been stronger than fear. He followed the path where the orbs had passed. The grass was flattened in a perfect arc, as though something had hovered just above it. He crouched down, fingers brushing the soil. It was still warm. Then a faint sound. A splash, far off in the swamp. He turned sharply. Probably a gator, he muttered, trying to steady his nerves. But something felt off. Gators didn't splash like that. This was different. Heavier, rhythmic, like footsteps in water. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his bare foot. He yelped and stumbled backwards, sitting hard on the earth. A thorn?
No.
He looked down. A small metal shard, no bigger than a coin, was embedded in the sole of his foot. It shimmered with the same bluish hue as the orbs. Carefully, he pulled it out, wincing as blood pooled around the wound. The shard was unlike anything he had seen, light as air, but unnaturally smooth, with fine lines etched into its surface like circuitry. Don Alejandro stood slowly, breathing heavily. He pocketed the shard and limped back to the tent. Whatever had happened tonight was no trick, no prank. He zipped the tent shut and stayed awake till dawn. When the sun rose, the children emerged from the cabin, yawning and stretching. Carlos spotted his father sitting outside the tent, looking pale. "You all right, Poppy?" Don Alejandro forced a smile. "Didn't sleep much. You see a snake or something?" He opened his mouth to answer, but stopped. Behind Carlos, Sophia had frozen mid-step, eyes wide. "Where's your phone?" she asked. "In my pocket." "Why?" "Mine's gone. Mateo's, too." The little boy came running from inside. "I left it on the charger. It's not there anymore." Don Alejandro's smile faded. He stood up slowly and walked to the cabin. Inside, wires from the chargers were scattered across the floor, but the phones were indeed missing. No broken windows. No signs of entry. Just silence. Then he noticed something else, muddy footprints. Barefoot. Small. Leading in from the porch and vanishing at the hallway. Footprints that didn't belong to any of them. The air inside the cabin had shifted. There was a stillness now, heavy and strange, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Don Alejandro knelt to inspect the footprints more closely. The mud had already begun to dry, but what stood out were the details. No shoes, no sandals, just bare feet with long, narrow toes and unusually high arches. Mateo clung to his sister's side, his small hands trembling. "Was someone in here last night?" he asked in a whisper. Sophia didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the hallway where the prints vanished. Carlos stepped past her, opening the door to the bathroom, then the small storage room. Nothing. No signs of intrusion. No one hiding. But the prints had definitely ended in the corridor. "Let's not panic," Don Alejandro said calmly, though his voice betrayed a slight tremor. "We'll clean these up, have breakfast, and take a proper look around. Maybe someone wandered in while we slept. Some camper." Even he didn't believe the words as they left his lips. Later that morning, while the children sat on the porch eating cereal from paper bowls, Don Alejandro returned to the tree line where the lights had appeared. He scanned the ground carefully, each step cautious. That's when he found the second shard. Lying at the base of a mangrove, it glinted in the sun. Identical to the one he had pulled from his foot, only this one was clean, no blood, no scratches. He picked it up using a handkerchief, then slipped it into his pocket. A rustle behind him made him spin round. "Hello," he called. Nothing. Just the wind stirring the Spanish moss that hung from the trees like curtains. But then he heard it, a voice. Or perhaps many voices. Whispering. He turned toward the sound. It came from the swamp. Faint but rhythmic, like chanting carried by the breeze. Not English. Not Spanish. A language that didn't belong. He took a few steps into the shallow water, boots squelching in the mud. "Who's there?" he called again. The voices stopped. A bubble rose from beneath the water surface, followed by another. Then silence. Don Alejandro stood very still, listening. Suddenly, a sharp splash erupted nearby. He flinched, raising his arms instinctively. But it wasn't an animal. Floating to the surface was a shape, a bundle of sticks tied together with a red string. Curious, he picked it up. It was fashioned like a small effigy, maybe 8 inches tall, with arms, legs, and a crude head. Something was carved into its chest. A spiral. He turned it over in his hands. The spiral was filled with something dark, dried, almost tar-like. Not paint. Something organic. Unnerved, he made his way back to the cabin. As he approached, he noticed Carlos standing on the porch, holding something in his hands. A phone. One of the missing ones. "I found it in the fire pit," Carlos said, confused. "But it's not burnt. Not even warm." Don Alejandro took the phone. The screen was dark.
Dead.
He pressed the power button. Nothing. Then he turned it over and froze. The same spiral, scratched faintly into the back. That afternoon, the family tried to resume some sense of normality. Carlos and Sofia played cards at the picnic table, while Mateo drew with chalk on the wooden steps. Don Alejandro sat in a rocking chair on the porch, the effigy hidden in his coat pocket and the 2 shards wrapped in a sock inside his duffel bag. But his eyes never left the edge of the trees. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, the breeze would rustle the bushes, and he would flinch. Once, he thought he saw movement, a shadow ducking behind a cypress, but when he stood up, there was nothing. As night fell, the air thickened again. The insects fell quiet. The frogs stopped croaking, the kind of silence that made even the children pause. "Can we sleep inside tonight?" Sofia asked. Don Alejandro nodded.
Yes.
Everyone sleeps in the cabin. He double-checked the locks, closed all windows, and slid a chair under the front doorknob. They curled up in the living room together, blankets piled on the floor. It was some time past midnight when Mateo began to stir. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, then slowly looked toward the window. At first, he didn't move. Then, in a whisper, "There's someone outside." Don Alejandro was instantly awake. He crept to the window and peered out between the slats. A figure stood just beyond the porch light. Not close enough to make out the face. Not far enough to dismiss. "Carlos," he said quietly. "Hand me the torch." Carlos obeyed, his hands trembling. Don Alejandro opened the front door a crack and shone the light into the trees. Nothing. He stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under his feet. He swept the beam side to side, then froze.
Eyes. 6 of them.
3 pairs, reflecting the light from the torch. Unblinking. Low to the ground. Watching. They disappeared at once. He dashed forward, but there was no one there. No rustle of retreating animals. Just empty darkness and the heavy sound of his own breath. Then he saw them. Symbols, freshly carved into the trees. The spiral. Again. But now with lines branching from it like limbs. Or roots. He took a step back. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Sofia's voice, trembling. "Dad. Mateo's not here." He ran inside. Blankets tossed aside. The front door still locked. Mateo was gone. Panic surged through the cabin like a lightning strike. Don Alejandro turned over cushions, pulled open cupboards, checked under every bed, calling Mateo's name with growing desperation. But the boy was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no sound to indicate how he had vanished from a locked room. Sofia sat on the floor clutching a blanket, her knuckles white. Carlos stood by the front door, fists clenched, eyes fixed on the woods beyond. "We have to find him," Carlos said.
Now.
Don Alejandro grabbed a torch and a kitchen knife, more a comfort than a weapon, and led them into the night. The forest was dense, its trails damp and slippery. Branches clawed at their clothes as they pushed deeper into the mangroves. After 100 meters or so, they found something. A small wooden figure tied to a low branch, identical to the effigy found earlier. This one was damp and hanging from its foot. A tiny scrap of Mateo's t-shirt was caught on the twine. "He came this way," Don Alejandro muttered. Further along the path, the forest opened into a clearing where the moonlight pooled like silver. At its center stood a tree much older than the others, its roots bulging from the earth like twisted snakes. Beneath it, shallow pools of water reflected the moon, and something else. Symbols. Spirals and lines, drawn in dark mud along the trunks and roots. The same ones from the trees by the cabin. Don Alejandro stepped forward cautiously. Suddenly, Sofia grabbed his arm. "Look." Across the clearing, a figure darted between trees. Then another. Not animals. Human shapes. Moving too quickly, too fluidly. Their outlines blurred by the darkness, but their eyes gleamed like polished glass. Then, from behind the ancient tree, came the sound of footsteps in water.
Splash. 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 Mateo.
His voice. Papa? It was faint, like an echo, but definitely his voice. They sprinted forward, slipping through mud, crashing through bushes. The sound grew louder until it stopped.
Just like that.
Cut off. They found a shallow stream running between the trees, its waters dark and slow. And on the opposite bank, footprints. Small ones. Mateo's. Don Alejandro dropped to his knees, examining them. They were fresh. Carlos crossed first, nearly falling as his foot slipped on a submerged root. Don Alejandro helped Sofia across, then followed. They moved quickly, following the prints, which led deeper into the trees. Then they stopped. The last footprint ended at a tree trunk. No more prints. No sign of direction. As if the boy had vanished into thin air. Don Alejandro looked up and froze. Carved into the bark above the final footprint was something new. A handprint. But it wasn't made by a child. It was twice the size of Don Alejandro's own, its fingers long and clawed, pressed deep into the wood. And in the center of the palm, the spiral. By sunrise, they had returned to the cabin, mud-streaked, exhausted, and shaken. None of them had spoken since the clearing. Not a word. They sat silently on the wooden floor, the morning sun barely piercing the heavy mist that now cloaked the woods. Don Alejandro stared at the spiral carved into his memory. It wasn't just a symbol now. It was a presence. Watching. Waiting. Carlos broke the silence. I've seen that spiral before. Don Alejandro turned sharply. Where? In the old photo album, Carlos said. The one with Abuela's things. There was a house. With symbols on the door. They found the album buried under old magazines in a drawer. Its cover was cracked leather, its pages brittle and yellowed with time. Carlos flipped through, his fingers moving quickly until… there. A black and white photograph of a wooden house deep in a mangrove swamp. It looked older than any structure should survive in the humidity of South Florida. On the door, just above the handle, was the spiral. Faint, but unmistakable. Sofia leaned over. Is that here? In the same forest. Don Alejandro nodded slowly. It must be. They packed what little they needed, water, torches, a small compass, and set off in search of the house. The deeper they walked, the stranger the woods became. Trees twisted unnaturally, their trunks bending toward the trail as if listening. Birds flew in silent arcs, never calling out. Even the insects had gone mute. Hours passed. Then they saw it. Partially hidden behind a curtain of vines and Spanish moss stood the house from the photograph. Its roof sagged to one side, and its boards were black with rot, but it was unmistakably the same place. Carlos stopped at the edge of the clearing. It's waiting for us. Don Alejandro approached first. The front door hung slightly ajar. As he pushed it open, the hinges groaned like a dying animal. Inside, dust danced in the shafts of light that pierced the broken roof. The floor was warped, walls buckling under decades of moisture. Yet amidst the decay, everything was orderly. Chairs tucked in, books lined up neatly, and on the table, in the center of the room, lay a single wooden mask. Long-nosed, with hollow eye sockets and spiral carvings across its brow. Sofia shivered. This place hasn't been abandoned. Not really. Then, from the back room, footsteps.
Slow.
Deliberate. They froze. Don Alejandro reached for the door to the next room and opened it. Nothing. An empty chamber. A window with no glass. Just vines curling through the frame. Then he saw it. Another carving on the wall. But this time not a spiral.
A name. Mateo.
The room was silent.
Too silent.
Don Alejandro stared at the name carved into the wood. It was recent. The edges of the letters were clean, not weathered like the rest of the house. Someone had been here. Someone who knew Mateo. Carlos stepped forward, his voice low. He's alive. He has to be. They searched the room, tapping on the walls, moving aside dusty furniture, looking for any sign. A trapdoor. A journal. Anything. But there was nothing. Then Sofia noticed something. Behind the warped dresser, there was a seam in the wooden wall. barely visible. She pressed her fingers along it. The panel gave slightly. "A door," she whispered. Don Alejandro helped her slide it open. It was narrow and stiff, releasing a musty breath of air as it creaked inward. Behind it was a dark corridor. Unlit.
Silent.
Without a word, they entered. The corridor was made of old timber, walls close enough to brush their shoulders. The air was damp and cold. As they moved forward, the walls seemed to narrow further, as if the house were shrinking around them. After several minutes of walking, they reached a small chamber lit by thin slats in the ceiling. Inside, wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with jars. Hundreds of jars. Sophia picked one up. Inside was a butterfly, perfectly preserved, but unmoving. Carlos examined another. A lizard, eyes closed, suspended in a thick, amber-colored fluid. Don Alejandro stepped back, his voice shaking. "This is a collection." They all turned to a low table in the center of the room. On it, surrounded by scattered bones and feathers, was a book. Its cover was bound in cracked leather, and carved into it was the same spiral, the same ancient symbol. He opened it slowly. Pages filled with drawings, rituals, names, locations, then photographs, faces of children, some smiling, some with eyes wide in terror. And among them,
Mateo.
His photo was newer than the others, glued hastily to the page, under a series of symbols that none of them recognized. Sophia recoiled. "What is this place?" "A shrine," Don Alejandro said. "Or a prison." A sudden wind blew through the corridor behind them, though no doors had opened. Then came the whispering, soft at first, like the rustle of leaves, then clearer. Mateo's voice.
Calling.
From within the walls. "Help me." Carlos ran back into the corridor, torch raised. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a storm of voices. The walls trembled. The slats of the ceiling creaked as dust fell from above. Then, a thud. Behind the wall to their right. Don Alejandro slammed his palm against the timber, shouting Mateo's name. Again, a thud. Louder. And then, a crack appeared. The wall splintered outward. A hand reached through. Small.
Dirty.
Clutching desperately.
Mateo.
Still alive. But before they could grab him, something else moved. From the shadows behind the boy, a figure emerged.
Tall.
Cloaked in strips of dark cloth. Its face hidden beneath a long-nosed mask carved with spirals. It reached for the child. Don Alejandro screamed, and everything went black. When Don Alejandro awoke, his head throbbed and the air smelled of mold and damp earth. A faint light flickered above him, swaying, casting elongated shadows across a low-ceilinged room made of stone and dirt. He tried to move, his wrists were bound with rough rope. Across the chamber, Carlos and Sophia were also tied, still unconscious. Nearby, an iron brazier burned with a bluish flame, giving off no heat. Then came the sound. Footsteps.
Soft.
Measured. A figure stepped into view. The mask. It was the same long-nosed wooden face they had seen in the house, now clearer, closer. The spirals on its surface glinted with a strange varnish, and the eyes behind it, though hidden, radiated something ancient. Patient. It spoke. Not in English. Not in Spanish. A guttural, winding tongue, thick with age and echo. The words coiled around the room like smoke, and with each phrase, the brazier's flame flared. Don Alejandro's vision blurred, but he could feel the voice, not just in his ears, but in his bones. As if it wasn't speaking to him, but into him. The masked figure stepped closer and removed something from its robe.
The book.
The same leather-bound tome they had found. It was open to the page with Mateo's photo. The masked figure pointed at the image. Then at the flame. Then at Don Alejandro. "No," he whispered. The figure turned to a stone basin and dipped a claw-like hand into a black liquid. With slow, deliberate strokes, it painted a spiral onto the dirt floor. Carlos stirred. Then Sophia. "What's happening?" Sophia's voice trembled. Don Alejandro didn't answer.
He couldn't.
The figure began to chant again, louder now. The walls pulsed with the rhythm. Dust fell from the ceiling. Suddenly, from the far end of the chamber, a cry pierced the air.
Papa. Mateo. Alive.
Behind a rusted grate, barely visible in the shadows, Carlos fought against his ropes. We have to get him. The masked figure raised a long, curved knife. Sophia screamed. But before the blade could fall, the chamber shook violently. The ground cracked. The flame flared high, turning white. The spiral on the floor began to collapse inward, like it was pulling the room itself into it. From the grate, Mateo reached through and threw something, a small glass jar. It shattered at the masked figure's feet. Whatever was inside, ash, dust, or something older, sent the figure stumbling back. Carlos broke his bindings. Don Alejandro shouted, "The flame! Extinguish it!" Sophia kicked over the brazier. The blue fire scattered, hissing, dying on the stone floor. The spiral halted. The walls stopped trembling. But the masked figure did not fall. It rose, slower now, as if wounded. From behind its mask, it hissed, not in anger, but in warning. "You cannot break the circle." Then it vanished into the darkness of the far tunnel. Carlos rushed to the grate and pulled Mateo free. The boy clung to him, weeping. Don Alejandro limped toward the remains of the spiral, now broken and smeared across the floor. "Come on," he said, his voice hoarse. "We're not safe yet." They didn't know how many tunnels the figure could use, how many more spirals there were. But they had Mateo, and for now that was enough. They didn't stop running until they saw the skyline again. After winding through the underground tunnels, pushing past damp stone and splintered roots, they emerged into the open air behind a cluster of mangroves near Biscayne Bay. The morning light felt unreal, too clean for what they had just endured. Mateo squinted at the sun. His face was pale, his clothes torn, but his eyes were still alive. "We have to tell someone," Sophia said. "The police. Anyone." "No one will believe this," Carlos replied, gently holding his brother close. "Not without proof." Don Alejandro scanned the shoreline. "We need rest. Then we find that book again. And we end this." They found refuge in a nearby boathouse owned by a family friend, safe for the night. While Mateo slept, clutching a pillow like it was a shield, Don Alejandro spread out the scattered notes he had stuffed into his jacket from the ritual room. Drawings, coordinates, snippets of language he didn't understand. But one phrase appeared again and again. El círculo debajo. The circle below. With help from an old university contact, an anthropologist based at the University of Miami, they discovered something chilling. There were spirals like the one they had seen carved into old buildings across the city. Drainage grates. Abandoned metro tunnels. Even the foundations of historic villas. All hiding in plain sight. "These aren't just symbols," the professor had said over the phone. "They're gates." Carlos stood over a city map, the spiral sketches laid atop it. "They line up," he said, forming a ring. "A ritual circle," Don Alejandro muttered, "beneath the city." "And it's not complete," Sophia added, pointing to the missing section, right under Coconut Grove. "That's where it'll try again," Carlos said. "To finish the ritual." They packed what they could, cameras, flashlights, tools, and went into the tunnels once more, this time prepared. Mateo refused to stay behind. "I'm not afraid," he whispered. "Not anymore." Night had fallen when they reached the final access point, an old maintenance hatch behind a derelict hotel. The air felt colder the deeper they climbed, and the darkness was heavier than before. Wet stone turned to carved paths. Unnatural angles. Faint whispers ahead. The tunnel opened into a circular chamber. At its center was the last spiral, carved deeper than the rest, its grooves filled with something black and moving. But they weren't alone. Figures stood around the spiral.
Dozens of them.
Masks.
Robes.
Hands clasped. Eyes blank. They didn't speak. They didn't move. Until one stepped forward. The same mask. The same voice. "You broke the rhythm," it said. but it can be restored. From the shadows behind it, a second spiral began to glow. The chamber trembled. "Stop it," Don Alejandro warned, holding up the book they had recovered. "End this." But the masked figure raised a blade again, longer, carved with fresh symbols. Mateo stepped forward. He held a jar, the same kind he had thrown before. The masked figure paused. "You don't understand," it hissed. "You can't stop it. It has already begun." Then Mateo smashed the jar. Its contents erupted in a cloud of ash and light. The spiral darkened. The glowing lines broke apart like glass under pressure. The circle fractured. The masked follower screamed, not in pain, but in loss, as if something vital had been taken. Then silence. They collapsed one by one into the dust. The chamber grew still. Then, from deep within the cracked spiral, a single voice whispered, "Not yet." The spiral chamber was collapsing. Dust spiraled through the air, thick and choking. Cracks splintered along the curved walls, as if the very earth had been wounded. Don Alejandro grabbed Mateo and pulled him back. Carlos and Sofia led the way, guiding them towards an arched tunnel barely visible in the shaking gloom. Behind them, the last remnants of the masked congregation crumbled into silence. No footsteps followed, only the dying echoes of something ancient, something denied. They stumbled through the passage, the darkness tightening around them, until finally, a rusted maintenance ladder appeared. Carlos climbed first, then Mateo, Sofia, and Don Alejandro last, pushing the grate above them open with a loud metallic groan. They emerged in an alley behind a shuttered cafe in Coconut Grove. The sky had begun to lighten.
Dawn.
Pale, quiet, almost indifferent. Mateo sat on the curb, trembling, watching a stray cat pick its way across the road. Don Alejandro placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. Carlos shook his head.
No.
It's paused. He held up the broken book. Its pages were ash along the edges, and the photograph of Mateo had burned into nothing. Yet at the very center, one symbol remained. A spiral. This one open. Incomplete. Sofia sat beside him. "Do you think it'll come back?" Don Alejandro didn't answer. His gaze turned to the rising sun, to the normalcy of traffic in the distance, to the sound of someone unlocking their shop door like any other morning. Then a new sound. Faint, like a hum. They turned. It came from a nearby storm drain. Don Alejandro moved slowly, crouching near the grate. He pulled a small mirror from his coat and angled it toward the darkness. Nothing. Then movement. Not a creature. Not a person. A shape.
A twist.
A spiral. Tiny but pulsing. He backed away. "We leave Miami," he said. "Tonight." Carlos nodded. Sofia took Mateo's hand. But before they stood, Don Alejandro looked at the grate one last time. There, etched faintly into the iron rim, almost invisible. "We are the circle. We do not end." They left the alley in silence. No words of triumph. No final declarations. Only the slow return to the world above. But far beneath the city, in the places people forget, the spiral waited. Still turning. Still watching. Still wanting.